I'd like to continue the presentation I started before on John Loftus's book called Why I Became an Atheist. This book, I think, gives us an opportunity to explore some of the criticisms of Christianity and criticisms of belief in God that are provided by various contemporary atheists. In my first presentation, I went a little off of where I had intended to go. I'd intended to talk about his critique of St. Thomas Aquinas' version or versions of the cosmological argument for God's existence, and I'd like to get back to that hopefully in a few moments, but I wanted to finish up the thought that I had thrown out at the end of the last presentation, which was, I think that Mr. Loftus's outsider's test of faith, among various criticisms that I'd have of it, and I hope to get back to that sometime soon. I wrote down about 13 or 14 criticisms or observations about his outsider test of faith that I'd like to eventually get to, because I think for Mr. Loftus, at least based on what I've heard and what I've read, he thinks that's really the core of his presentation. The rest of it is simply working out the implications of that. He admits that every argument that he makes is susceptible to challenge, but that if he creates some doubt or question about various different things and provides alternatives, then the skeptical disposition that he argues we should fundamentally have toward religious truth claims should weigh things in the direction of unbelief rather than in the direction of belief, even though a believer could continue to offer plausible responses to everything that he says. After a while, if we begin with the predisposition that we're probably wrong about our religious faith, then the questions that he raises should be sufficient to deter one from religious belief. But at the end of my last presentation, I was suggesting a different approach to these questions. He mentions in his Outsider's Test of Faith chapter in his book, he mentions René Descartes, the famous French philosopher, who sometimes is considered the first modern philosopher. René Descartes famously, in his book called Meditations, in his meditations he sets up a kind of experiment where he systematically doubts everything that can be doubted. In other words, he takes a disposition of unbelief or of doubt toward everything in hopes that he can see what will withstand the process of doubt. So what he does is he begins by calling in question his sense experience, that he looks around at the world and he asks, can I doubt my sense experiences give to me true knowledge of the world? And he concludes, yes, I can. I can doubt that my sense experience gives me true knowledge of the world because I have the experience of dreams in which I think that what I'm experiencing while I'm having the dream is real, but then I wake up to realize that it was just all a figment of my imagination, or it's something coming from my subconscious or whatever. And so in my waking states, I know that dream states are not real, but in my dream states themselves, typically, I don't know that. And so how do I know that my waking states are not just glorified dreams or more vivid dreams? How do I know the whole thing is not just some grand dream? This is part of, just a very small part, of various different philosophical perspectives down through the centuries that have argued a kind of idealism, that ideas are what is really real, and that the material world is really just a fabrication of the mind, or it's just an aspect of our mental existence. And there are contemporary defenses of that as well. I read one not too long ago, and then there's some great ones historically. People like Hegel in the 19th century would be one example. So there have been plenty of people who have argued that sense experience is fundamentally deceptive. Interestingly, Mr. Loftus appeals to Descartes at one point, but then says, I don't go as far as Descartes without explaining himself. I would be curious to know, why not go all the way down the road with Descartes? Why not take a fundamental position of doubt toward everything? Why limit your skepticism to Christianity or to religion? Why not extend your skepticism to everything? Why not presuppose that we should doubt all the discoveries or the claims of science, for example? Why not doubt all of the conclusions of science? You might say, well, they work. Well, sure, they work in that sense. At least sometimes they work. But just because it works doesn't mean that it's true, and it doesn't mean that the explanation that you've been given is true. And furthermore, how much of it do you really know through experimentation yourself? It works the way that they tell you it works. Perhaps there's a totally different explanation of it. And then to go back to Descartes, perhaps it's all just a figment of your imagination anyway. And so why not take a fundamental disposition of doubt toward all scientific claims, toward all historical claims, Why not take a position of doubt toward the claims of what your parents have said to you about when you were born or your birth certificate? Perhaps it too is just a collection of fabrications. I suppose a birth certificate is fairly easy to reproduce. You see, the point is that we could take this approach of skepticism and doubt, and we could extend it to the point that we become skeptics of everything, that we have nothing upon which we can ground ourselves or believe. The reality is we as human beings tend to trust. We tend to trust wise persons, or those that we consider to be reasonable persons, informed persons, knowledgeable persons. And we don't take a position that I'm going to doubt everything until you can prove absolutely without any shadow of a doubt that something is true. Instead, we tend to take a probabilistic approach to things, that we accept that this is probably the case, that historically this happened, or that I was born on this date, or that my parents are telling me the truth, or that this person who says they love me really loves me. Probably that's the case. Sometimes I'm deceived, sometimes I'm wrong, but that's just what it means to be human. It means to be human is to be fallible. It's to be able to make a mistake, but it's not to take a position of radical skepticism, where I will not accept anything unless it can force itself upon my mind and make me choose to believe when my initial orientation is to not believe. I think that kind of radical skepticism is damaging and destructive to all human knowledge, not just to religious faith. So I think if we take an approach of cautious optimism and openness and belief, we avoid many of the problems here that Mr. Loftus presents. Now, at the end of the last presentation, I was talking a little bit about inclusivism, exclusivism, and pluralism. He mentions pluralism in his book. He quotes John Hick, for example, who's a famous pluralist religious philosopher. In the case of pluralism, the idea is that all religious belief systems are just many different roads or paths to the same destination, and no one of them has any objective truth value over against another. All of them are talking about something that is really ultimately indescribable and that transcends human thought categories. And therefore none of them are true in that sense, that they're objectively true to the exclusion of other systems of religious belief. They're all true and they're all false. They're all true in that they reach out to a reality, but a reality that can't be reduced to propositional speech or to one religious belief system. So the many different religions are just different paths to the same destination. On the other end of the spectrum, you have what's called exclusivism. In exclusivism, the idea is that one religious faith claims to be right, and therefore all the others are fundamentally false. And instead of seeing in them some type of common pursuit and experience, instead one religious belief system claims to be divinely revealed, and therefore all others are false. And usually this expresses itself within Christianity with the idea that if you don't believe like this, or you don't accept these ideas, then you go to hell, or that you are lost, because one's salvation is tied to accepting this series of propositional statements and understanding what they mean. Inclusivism, which is the third option here, and this happens to be the approach of the Catholic faith and of Orthodox faith and various other expressions of Christianity. Inclusivism takes the approach that both of these are onto something. Both of these have their finger on something that is true. It is true, in fact, that God transcends the human mind and all of our categories of speaking and understanding. However, that doesn't mean that we know nothing at all. We do know truths about God, but we know them finitely and as humans in a limited way. Our knowledge of God is very weak and it's very small. And so what we are all called to do as human beings is we are called to respond to what God gives to us, the revelation that God gives to us, the light that God gives to us. And everybody in the world, to some degree or another, has been approached by God. And in the Christian tradition, we believe that Christ is the supreme divine approach. In Jesus, God approaches the world in the highest, most perfect, most supreme way. And that in Christ, the fullness of what God wants to say to the world is expressed, is shown to the world. I can believe that. I can believe that Christ is God's supreme self-manifestation, and also believe that people see that light of Christ in various different ways, and that they don't see it with the same intensity or the same clarity. And God will judge those persons based on the light that they had. and if they are finally saved in the end. And it is our hope and our confidence that God's salvation will reach to all in some way or another. Not that all will be saved in the end, but that all will have a legitimate, real opportunity to respond to God's light and God's truth in a way that God alone knows. And so I don't have to stand up and say, well, this person's going to hell and that one's going to hell because they don't think exactly like I do. No two people think exactly alike. But that doesn't mean there's not a common truth, or that there's not a common experience, or that human beings are not accountable for what we know and what God has revealed to us and allowed us to know. So I think the inclusivist approach, one of the values of it is that it gives to us the opportunity to put aside the question of final judgment, and it allows us to recognize that human beings do have differences of understanding, and that there is a plurality of world religions, and that people do have a tendency to embrace what they have been given because they have a basic disposition of trust. So what the approach that I'm presenting, and the Catholic faith and others present, the approach that I'm taking here is that we acknowledge those to be realities, and that we acknowledge that it's human to do that. It's human to tend to believe one's parents and one's tradition and one's culture, and to accept those things. That doesn't mean that it should be assumed false. To assume that it's true is to be human. Now, as we grow and learn and come to understand, we see that perhaps things that we've been told, we don't understand them very well. Or perhaps there may be aspects of it that are false, or that there might be a better way to approach this. And I think the history of religions shows that that is true. If we go down through the centuries, Mr. Loftus mentions in his book various different religions. That if I had grown up in ancient Egypt, for example, I would be a polytheist of some sort. If I grew up in ancient Babylon, I would be a polytheist. If I grew up in the Far East, I would be a Buddhist or a Hindu or whatever. And argues as if that means that we are all historically, or most people are historically and socially conditioned so that there can't be widespread discovery of the weaknesses or the superiorities of certain ways of thinking over others. But I think to simply look back historically is to see that that simply is not true. That there have been many mass changes in religious faith and in various aspects of one's worldview down through the centuries. So ideas do have a permeating effect on a culture, and even though many people follow the lead of others and trust in those that they deem to have wisdom or understanding, it still is the sort of thing where there's a gradual enlightening or discovering or tendency of various cultures, a very mysterious thing, but one that shows that our cultures are not just fatalistic. It's not just that I'm born into a culture, therefore I will think this way or I will think that way. There are forces at work in cultures, including in our minds right now, as we think critically about things, as we seek to understand their causes and the reasons for them. We can be causes or instruments of social change, or of reinforcing convictions or belief systems, or undermining those belief systems. And so in the exchange of ideas, in the exchange of belief systems and defense of those belief systems, hopefully we get a sense at some point, as we expose ourselves to them, we get a sense of which are most powerful, which are most fulfilling, which are most convincing to the mind and to the human heart. So in any case, I think the approach that Mr. Loftus takes with this tendency towards skepticism is arbitrary to some degree. So the approach that Mr. Loftus takes in his book is unfortunately, I think, an arbitrary limiting of the range of his skepticism. That there's no, I don't see any powerful reason for stopping his skepticism at a certain point, which he does. He accepts certain principles governing thought, he accepts certain logical principles, he accepts certain scientific, the validity of the scientific method, and so on. I think that from a more critical standpoint, I would question his initial disposition toward doubt and skepticism as his fundamental orientation toward these sorts of questions. So I think that's one of his problems, but there's many more to come, but let me stop there for now.